Good evening all, and welcome. The holidays are upon us, and what better way to celebrate than stories of shadow people? Maybe they're the ones who fill your stockings on Christmas, or maybe not. I'm sure you'll find out soon enough. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My grandma's house is chock full of weird stories going way back. Pretty much everything weird and scary has happened in the hallway leading to the spare bedroom. My grandma would see my grandpa's silhouette walking down the hall. He'd stop at the door to their bedroom and peer in, and she'd ask if he needed something. He wouldn't answer and would keep walking. Peeved, she would get up to ask him again, only to find him in the living room sleeping or watching TV and insisting he'd been there the whole time. My mum has heard someone calling her name from the same hall, and once we were there alone house-sitting while my grandparents were out of town. They were due back late that night, and my mum and I both heard heavy footsteps coming from the hall. She told me they must have come home early, and as she went to greet them, she realized there was no one there. The guest room at the end of the same hall has a TV that will turn on by itself. They also had a couple stay there, and neither one was particularly superstitious. The next morning, the husband was unusually quiet. He finally got a chance to talk to my grandma alone, and said very simply, "Someone was watching us last night." He had seen a figure standing in the corner of the room staring at them, and had been so frightened that he'd just closed his eyes and tried to go back to sleep. When my grandma pressed for details, he kind of shrugged it off and didn't want to talk about it anymore. There's also a middle bedroom between the spare room and my grandparents' room, which we have always just called Tipsy Danger's room, because I used to stay with them so often. I was on my bed once when I heard a thump and then a skittering noise, like something had jumped off the bed and was running across the floor. I thought it was the cat being weird, so I sat up to see what she was doing, only to find that the cat was at the foot of the bed staring intently at the doorway to the hall. I looked around for a bit and was unable to find anything. Me, my wife, and our 2 children were on a trip from point A to point B. We planned to stop the first evening into our trip with a friend of ours who happened to be near our route. Since we would be arriving at about 1 a.m., our friend left the door unlocked so that we could let ourselves in. Now, this wasn't a large city by any means, but out in the sticks near DeKalb, Texas. So we slipped in as quietly as we could, went back to the room that had been set up for us, and proceeded to try and get some sleep. The room was roughly 10 by 10. Mobile home rooms, gotta love them. My daughter, the 4-year-old, was on a pallet of blankets on one side of the room, and my son started off there but got fussy, so my wife picked him up and let him sleep with us on the bed. The bed was pushed up in the corner, all the way, and I was sleeping up against the wall. My wife had the outside, and our son was somewhere in the mix. We closed the door and turned off the light. It's pitch dark. Roughly an hour later, I hear my wife scream that someone's in the room. I open my eyes and see a black figure move towards the door. I wear contacts, so I couldn't distinguish what I saw, only that it appeared to have been a human shape. I leapt from the bed and bear hugged the intruder. The problem was I couldn't get a hold of it, I could feel its body up against mine, but every time I went to bear hug it, my arms went through it. I could see the blackness. I felt the shape up against my body, but couldn't grab it. I was pushed away from whatever it was, and heard my wife scream something about the light. I went from where I thought the light switch was, and felt something clawing and scratching on my upper body. I found the light switch on the wall, and saw nothing. Absolutely nothing. Well, other than the damage from what looked like a tornado had hit our room. My wife was still in bed, scared, witless. My daughter was on one of the open corners of the room, cowering under a blanket, and my infant son was on the floor next to the bed. Being the manly man that I am, I did the most sane thing I've ever done, and that was open the door to the room. A bathroom was right next to our room, you see. Flicked on the light, and no one was in there. I turned on the next light I could find, and no one was there. I checked the front door. It was deadlocked and deadbolted from the inside. You can't leave a house and deadbolt a door from the inside. There were no other sounds, noises, or movement, and I run back to our room and call a friend. Yes, I should have checked physically, but at this point my adrenaline was wearing off, and panic was starting to settle in. Our friend answered and said she was okay, and then she walks down to our room where we take in what happened. My wife has calmed the baby and our daughter down. They're all fine. My wife has blood pouring from her mouth and can barely speak, and has deep scratch marks from her neck to her ears down to her breasts. I have a fat, bloody lip, deep scratch marks on my chest, neck, and back, even though I'd slept in a shirt that night. And I also have what looks like carpet burn on the top of my right foot. The sewing machine table that was in the room had been thrown across near where my daughter was laying. After we calmed down and collected our wits, we started probing what we just went through. I recounted everything you've heard, and my wife said that she heard the door open and a big black cat jump on her chest and began clawing at her. Its face was smushed up against hers, causing her to feel strangled. The cat then started using its paws to strangle her. She gasped out that someone was in the room, which is when I awoke to see a black figure moving across it. While this was going on, our friend heard absolutely nothing. No shouts, no bumping around, nothing. Our friend and most others that we've told the story to thinks that my wife and I were fighting each other in our sleep, which I'm not past believing. She sleeps with her eyes open at times and used to sleepwalk when she was younger, but we don't think this is the case. We've told a few other friends about it, and they've stated they've had similar experiences. Big black cat strangling someone in bed, and another person wakes up to see something, but the something gets away. The next thing that makes me think this wasn't a dream gone bad were my wounds. My wife's healed up fine. It took 2 months for the scratches on my chest, neck, and back to completely go away. The carpet burn, however, took 4 months to heal. We tried medicating ointments and nothing worked. We went to our doctor, but at that point it had begun clearing up on its own, and he didn't want to do anything. He made a comment saying that the spot looked like it had been burned. If you've ever seen a 3rd-degree burn, it looks similar. Now, I can believe that my wife can make the scratches, but not what was on my foot. You could make out a slightly visible scar through my hobbit-like foot hair. I am of the persuasion that these events were something spiritual. I owned this house down in South Georgia, near a town in the middle of nowhere called Moultrie. It's just a double-wide mobile home that's been seated on a foundation, so it qualifies as a house on the insurance. Anyway, the house itself isn't old. I lived there about 2 years before moving up to Atlanta to take a better job. While I lived there, I smoked often and always outside because I have kids. So from my front yard there was a large clearing across the road. It was overgrown with weeds and the like, but you could sort of tell that a house used to be there. Within weeks of my family moving in, I began to feel freaked out by being out on my front porch at night. During the day, I felt absolutely normal. There was something about the night that just didn't sit well, and I considered myself a believer in the paranormal and maybe a mild clairvoyant. So I felt like I knew that there was something. I was being watched, and so many people described these sort of events. I convinced myself it was nothing though, and simply fixed the issue by smoking out back instead of out front at night. My mum was over one afternoon during a small family grill out, and we were walking around the front lawn just checking out the garden. The sun was near setting, and you could barely see the light fading over the horizon when she went wide-eyed and stopped talking mid-sentence. I asked her what was wrong, and she just slowly lifts her hands and points in the direction of the aforementioned clearing. It was across the dirt road from my property, and I look towards that direction as I do, and see a dark shadow simply go from what looked like a dog form crouching over to a full bipedal humanoid shape. This thing was 10 feet tall. I mean, huge, if it were human. So I blink and rub my eyes for a second, before asking my mum, "Do you see what I see?" She confirmed by nodding, but is unable to make words. At this point, I'm really getting scared. Now I know that I wasn't mistaken by my feelings of being watched. I tell her we need to go inside. She agrees, so we begin to walk towards my front door slowly. At that moment, my spidey senses go off, and I turn to look back at the thing, as it does what looks like charge across the dirt road towards my lawn. I panic, my mum panics, and suddenly the creature lurches back, as though it ran into an invisible wall. We made it to the porch at that moment, and I have one foot in the door when my mum finally speaks and says, "Wait, it looks like it stopped." When I focus again on the thing, I notice it has no eyes, no defining form, only the dark outline of a shadow overcasting the already dark background of tall grass and the clearing with the surrounding trees. The thing charges forward again, but lurches back at the edge of the lawn. Freaked out, we assume it's paranormal, and there's nothing we can do about it. So we head inside. We tell everyone in there, and of course they think we're messing with them. Eventually everyone goes home, and I discuss it with my wife, who tells me to stop playing around. I wouldn't go out front at night again, and shortly thereafter we moved out into Atlanta. I knew the previous owners personally and contacted their son, my friends, to see if they had ever experienced anything like that. They said no, but strangely they had witnessed angels at the four corners of the lawn before. I'm not Christian, and am barely religious, more of a spiritual thing, so I go along with it since they are and listen carefully. Apparently their dad was a pastor at a church, and in doing so prayed constantly over the land and his family. Now, be it strange or not, the fact that they have claimed to seen angels at the four corners of the lawn, and that I have just witnessed who knows what, attempting to enter the lawn and almost being pushed back to the edge, was unsettling. The story ends anticlimactically, with me simply not going outside at night anymore. At least, not to the front. We move and try to forget it happened. I've since rented the place out to another family, and I haven't heard them say anything about it, though I did request they keep an eye on their kids, and not let them go across the road there. I later found out the house that used to be there had a small family that lived in it. The teenager actually went to middle school with me, but I never knew him. He ended his own life 3 years before I moved there, and the house across the street was demolished shortly thereafter. I won't ever cross the street again, and I wouldn't advise anyone else to do it either. When I was a child, I woke up to footsteps on the roof of my apartment, as I lived on the top floor. It sounded like something was running across the roof. Being a young child, and not really knowing when Christmas was, I ran into my parents' room as they slept, and was excited, telling them that Santa and his reindeer were on the roof. They woke up and told me to go back to sleep as it wasn't anywhere near Christmas. So I go back into my room and closed the door. I laid in my bed and clearly remembered a tall figure, which was shadowy, and can't remember any more of what happened after what I saw. After the event, all my life I've seen shadow figures. I've had dreams of grey aliens and having medical type experimentations done on me, and have woken up with scars that are perfect incisions that were made overnight and healed completely once I awoke. One time, I was in my grandparents' backyard around 1 or 2 a.m. with my Siberian husky and ex-girlfriend. We were sitting on a picnic bench just looking at the stars, as I would constantly see stars in space that started moving back and forth, as they were objects in space that were being flown by intelligence and enjoying the nice night. They lived in a rural area with practically no light pollution, and you could see so many stars it was quite beautiful and breathtaking. On this particular night, we were out there with the dog facing the forest, with about 4 acres of my grandparents' yard between us and the forest. We began to hear loud screams that didn't sound like human, fox, nor owl. Not to mention, the closest home was a mile or 2 away, and then all of a sudden my husky started barking at something in the field, and my ex and myself assumed it would be a deer or something like that, as only the dog could see it. The field was big and it was hard to see, so we calmed down the dog and continued to ignore him until he began snarling. I got down to the dog's level and tried to see which area of the field he was looking at, and tried to focus my eyes and saw a tall figure, and it made this screeching sound that I would constantly hear all the time. Instead of trying to run after it, my dog on a leash tried to run away, so my ex and I bolted inside, as she also saw it. Take it as you will, but when I lived in that house when I was alone, I felt like I was constantly being watched, even when I would walk upstairs and have to run up them, as I felt something was behind me that I couldn't see. I had a dream the other night, a lucid dream mind you, that I was with a guy whom I've never seen, but this guy seemed familiar. He had headphones on listening to music, the big over-ear studio headphones, and he proceeded to take the headphones off and place them in my head, which a folk rock song started to play as clear as day, a song I've never heard in my life. And all of a sudden, after I heard the music, the guy morphed into a grey-brown type alien, and my surroundings changed, and all of a sudden I was lying on some medical procedure table inside of a craft, and I instantly awoke and started crying. The alien in my dreams looked all the same with insane detail. Anytime I think about that event, seeing the tall shadow figure behind my door after closing it as a child makes me cry and sends chills throughout my whole body. Thank you for letting me share my stories. They have bothered me my whole life. I haven't shared these events and dreams with anyone except my current girlfriend. I'm 31 years old, and figured it was time to share, regardless of what people think of me. When I was a child, I lived in the Mojave Desert, which is ground zero for a lot of paranormal events, notably Roswell, Area 51, and also just tons of abandoned towns, which makes it all that much creepier. I was living relatively close to Edwards Air Force Base, which was pretty much Area 51 before we knew Area 51 existed. Anyway, in my childhood home, there was never any yelling or fighting. My parents were married and still are, and I was not abused in any way. Initially, I thought what had happened was a result of my parents hitting me for some reason, but I didn't see their faces because they did not have any in this instance. I remember that night so vividly. I didn't know about shadow people until I was around 15-16. Even then, I didn't connect that I had experienced them. I recently clicked a few months ago when I had thought back to the experience. So this one night, I was getting ready for bed, and I was in the bath. I was playing around with the bubbles in the bath and putting it on my head to make a hat. I'm pretty sure I washed it off my head, because I doubt I would go to bed with bubbles on my head. I had gone to sleep, but awoke, feeling a presence. Like I said before, I thought it was my parents, but these beings had no faces, and were just shadows. I had a nightlight, so I could tell that there was something there. I saw 3 or more of these shadow people moving around the front of my room and talking to each other about me. I don't know what exactly they were saying, but I knew they were speaking because they kept pointing at me and huddled up together as if, okay, what's the plan, y'all? I wasn't afraid of them until shortly after. After looking at them for a hot second, one of them shoots over and puts me in a chokehold while pushing me onto the pillow. I couldn't breathe and was squirming around trying to free myself. While this was going on, I see what you would see if you looked through a kaleidoscope, except instead of looking through it, it's like I fell into it. It reminded me of when you play PS2 and the camera would fall into that abyss of fog when it booted. I thought to myself, that's the last time I put soap on my head. I have never been abused, but I imagine that that is what it felt like. I fell into a deep-ass sleep. The morning after, I went up to my mum to tell her about it. At this point, my only experience with anything even slightly paranormal was at the movie Monsters, Inc., so I did not have the vocabulary to say what those beings were. My parents were super conservative and Christian, so they didn't let us find out about all that stuff. The conversation went like this. Mum, I saw Scully last night, and he hurt me. But Scully's a nice monster. He wasn't nice to me. Hella spooky, right? After that, I didn't sleep for 3 days straight, and had several panic attacks. My mum kept giving me Benadryl to make me go to sleep, but that just made me hallucinate, and made me become more afraid to go to sleep. I straight up saw bugs crawling out of the walls. Thanks, Mum. I was convinced that if I went to sleep, I would be attacked again, and this time, I would perish. Eventually, I did fall asleep, and fortunately, nothing has happened to me since then. When my family first moved into our new house in the country, I was happy about finally getting out of our previous home that was haunted. Unfortunately, It wasn't even a week of being there before the activity started in our new house. I still remember the first event that started the whole thing. I was in the house alone while everyone else was outside. I had to run out and ask my mum something, so I went through the kitchen on my way to the back door. The faucet was not running when I went past it on my way out, but as soon as I came in, I found it running full blast. Not just the cold water had been turned on, but the hot one as well. This was an event that happened several times to everyone in the house. Not to mention the dishwasher would start itself in the middle of the night, which us kids were blamed for, of course. That is, of course, until it started right in front of my stepdad and I. He called a repairman to check it out, since it happened so frequently at first, but there was nothing wrong with the switch, and the repairman showed us that it was impossible for the thing to start itself. We, as a family, talked about these little events in general conversation from time to time, but there was another event that we were all experiencing that we didn't talk about, because it was the kind of thing that was questionable. I had been seeing what looked like someone walking past the windows of the house from the corner of my eye almost daily, but felt stupid saying something since I never saw it while I was looking at the window, and when I ran out to see who was there, of course there'd be no one. Since no one else had mentioned seeing this, I had the idea that perhaps I was the only one, until we'd been there around 8 months. We were all sitting in the living room watching TV, when I saw someone go by one window. I looked over at the window, and there was nothing there, but just as I got my eye on the window, the figure went past the other window in the room. I immediately noticed, and my mum and stepdad looked over at the window at the same time. I knew right then that they had seen it too, so I asked them if they saw someone going past the window. They and my brother all said yes, and we sprinted out running to see who it was. There was no one. When we came back in, I opened up and told everybody that I had been seeing the thing the whole time. At that point, everyone came out and said they'd been seeing it too, which gave me a huge feeling of relief. At least I wasn't crazy. We had all been seeing it regularly, but were too afraid to say anything for the same reason I didn't. The shadow people we were seeing in the corner of our eyes continued for several years after we moved in, and then it just suddenly stopped out of the blue for a while. My mum told me later, after I was out the house for a while, that she was occasionally seeing it again when I brought it up. It was just another one of those weird things that happened in the house that we all eventually had to get used to. I would be reading or playing with my toys, and as all young children do, I began to reminisce of recent events and conversations. Then, as I remembered something specific that was said, I would literally hear a spoken word or two whispered directly into my ear. It would shock me because I knew I was alone, but what used to scare me was the black shadow man who I would then notice standing there. The second my eyes tried to fixate on and rationalize what I was seeing, it would instantly disappear. He was always wearing a thin, brimmed hat. This all happened in South Florida. I never felt paralyzed, and every time I saw him, I was wide awake in broad daylight. I saw him when I was playing in the living room, and only at one particular house. It was unnerving. This started 1 year ago, around the beginning of September 2017. I would occasionally wake up in the middle of the night to strange noises coming from the hallway and seeing strange shadows walk past my open door. As the months went by, they got worse and worse until it happened. September 2018. I was lying on my bed, tossing and turning trying to sleep, with the worst paranoia I've ever experienced. After hours of attempting to fall asleep with no result, I finally decided to go into my mum's room. I slowly climbed out of my bed and grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and began slowly walking out of the room, flicking my head back and forth, scanning my surroundings. It seemed to suffocate me. I walked through my kitchen to get to my mum's room, where the clock read 2:15 a.m. I walked straight into my mum's room, just to see my two little sisters already hanging up the bed. Now I know that I'm 14, but sometimes being scared makes you feel vulnerable. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the lamp illuminating my sister's room, and made my decision. I went to Alia's and Olivia's room, and jumped in the bed, keeping the lamp on. I hugged the wall and finally managed to obtain slumber. Next thing I remember, I was sitting up in bed staring at the black abyss beyond the open door. I slowly whispered 3 times, "I see you," and after the last syllable left my mouth, I noticed a little glass circle in the palm of my hand. It was all fogged out except one little clear circle. I looked through the hole in the glass, and what I saw burned an image in my mind which I'll never forget. A young boy was standing in the doorway staring at me. He was dressed in an old pioneering outfit with a top hat, his hair long, shaggy and black, his long face pale white. In fact, everything on him was black or white. Everything but his eyes, they were yellow. I immediately put the glass down, and as I did it, it was like he teleported, because the next thing I knew he was crouched right in front of my face and pulled the biggest smile. His teeth, the same color as his eyes. I burst awake, eyes wide open, facing the ceiling. I tried to get out of bed but couldn't. I was terrified. My ears were ringing to the point where I couldn't hear anything else. It was so loud yet so quiet. I felt pressure on my chest like someone was pushing really hard. But that wasn't the worst part. The boy from my dream was standing in my doorway, staring at me. He wasn't even moving. It was enough for me to panic myself into oblivion. I tried to get out of there ASAP, but nothing worked. After what felt like an eternity, everything snapped back into place. No more boy, no more ringing, no more tension. I could move again. After that experience, I immediately noped right into my mum's bed between the kids already there, and finally fell asleep at 3:15 a.m. I live in this ranch-style house. My bedroom is at the back of the house and has a single picture window that looks out onto the backyard. The window itself is probably 7 to 8 feet off the ground because the entrance to the crawl space was directly below the window. Also, there's this tree in the backyard that's involved. It's 20 feet from my bedroom window. I don't know what kind of tree it is, but it's an evergreen tree, and the bark can be pulled off in stringy bits. I'm around 5'6" tall, and if I'm standing at the base of the tree, the branches closest to the ground would still be over my head. So these branches that were closest to the ground were at least 6 inches off the ground. It happened in 1998, sometime in late August or early September. It was after school started. I was a sophomore in high school at the time, and I remember it was on a Sunday. My mum dragged me to church that morning. My friend and I had started talking about religion. It was nothing specific about religion, but we were talking about it in general. After church, my mum and I went out to eat lunch. When I got home, my friend called. We continued our conversation, and I took the cordless phone to my bedroom, and I was pacing back and forth while speaking to them. I take a few steps towards the window turn, take a few steps towards the opposite wall and repeat. At one point I walked down towards the opposite wall, turned to face the window, and that's when I saw this shadow that looked like a person from the neck up. I quickly tried to find something that could have cast a shadow of that shape, but couldn't. Then I realized the shadow had a 3D quality to it, and I audibly said, "Oh God." I suppose it realized I could see it, and it appeared to drop. I ran towards the window in time to see it run across the backyard to the tree. It started to climb the tree. It got to the lowest branches and it stopped. It stopped climbing and looked at me to see if I was watching it. While it was looking at me, it grabbed a few of the branches. It held the branches for a bit and then started climbing again as it vanished. My friend heard me say, "Oh my God," and asked me what was happening. I told him what I'd seen, and he told me to start thinking of God because, according to him, what I had just seen was a demon. A few days later, I go back out into my backyard for another reason. I look at the tree, and it reminded me of what happened. I went over to the tree, and that's when I noticed that the couple of branches this thing had grabbed and was held onto were dead. I could tell these branches specifically were dead because all the needles on these two branches were brown, while all the other needles on the tree were green. A few days after that, all the needles from just those two branches had fallen to the ground and were laying in a pile. Several years later, while working the graveyard shift as a security guard, I gathered up the courage to call this famous late-night radio talk show and told my story. The host asked me if the eyes were glowing red. I told him no, because this thing's eyes weren't glowing at all. He said that in his experience, if the eyes were glowing red, it was a demon. Otherwise, it was something else. I lived previously in a small 2-story house with an unfinished basement along a main road. It was a nice brick house with around 0.8 acres in the backyard. The house was built in the mid-40s to 50s and is roughly 60 years old. The past owners of the house died inside it, and what my parents heard from the neighbors is that the husband was part of a cult. But me and my brother experienced a few strange things in the house. The first one was when the basement door slammed like someone was very angry at something, and it awoke my parents. The second one when I was trying to get some sleep, as I had a hard time getting to sleep when I was younger. The hallway light flickered on and off, and then my door creaked open. The third experience was when I was trying to get to sleep, but instead of the door slowly creaking open, it slammed open, and there behind it was a black figure with glowing red eyes, like a ball of pure hatred and evil. Me and my brother have had many experiences with this demon, and ran into it on a regular basis. But the one experience that stands out from the rest is when me and my brother were watching TV in the basement and had a tent set up. Now at the time we had fixed any air leaks in the basement and had no AC down there. But after a while I felt like someone was slapping the small tent me and my brother were in. So I checked it out and saw nothing, and went back to watching TV. Now a while later, the TV signal began to falter. It was like someone was taking this TV signal away from us, but then it suddenly turned black. Not off, black. I tried turning it on and off, and even unplugged and plugged it back in. I even took the TV out of its place on the entertainment system, but it remained black. Then at some point, I set it back in its place and went around to get my parents. But the basement was locked, and it only locked from the basement side of the door. I went back down, and that's when it happened. All of the lights were off. My flashlight, the ceiling lights, everything. Then the lights went on, and then off again. But in that brief flash of light, I saw the dark figure. I shined my flashlight in the direction I saw him last, and there he was. He stepped towards me, and made a full sprint towards the back room, which was still unfinished. I turned the TV off, booked it for the door, and me and my brother ran to our beds. In the house we live in now, I've only seen the black figure a few times. In my window in the property surrounding my house, and by the cemetery. That may have been short experiences, but they have nevertheless been very creepy. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you've enjoyed tonight's video. My voice is getting back to normal, however, it still sounds a bit gravelly. It sounded worse. Part of me thought if it sounds better than my regular voice, but in truth, it hurt to narrate when I tried the other day, so I couldn't keep it up. I do hope that you all enjoyed tonight's video. I actually really enjoyed tonight's Shadow People Tales. I don't do this topic anywhere near as often as I should, but it is quite fun, in my opinion. If you liked it, please don't forget to let me know in the comments and or in the description. No, not the description, in the comments. Just let me know in the comments and drop a like. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and press the bell icon to be notified each and every time I post. It is normally pretty frequently. So, what do I have in store for you? I'm hoping to have videos coming out every day for the next, every day until, even on Christmas, I think. In any case, I wanted to tell you something that happened to me yesterday, just because it has been an absolute nightmare, and I put it in the secret message section, so if you read it yesterday, here you get your fill of what happened. Essentially, we have family round now. Not at this very moment, they've gone to the mall, but we have family round and they're going to be staying with us for a week or 2 weeks. In any case, we rented a car under my credit card because you need to leave a deposit physically in person. And the place we rented it from, the airport they arrived to, is 4 hours away. Great. So yesterday I made the 4-hour trip. Showed up, but the car rental people never showed, as they specified on their email. That was strange. And before my family arrived, the car rental people never answered the phone for half hour. And when they finally did answer the phone, they told me, very blasé by the way, that they didn't have the vehicle, that it was damaged, it was in the garage, or the repair shop, whatever you call it, and that it was just too bad, and they could offer me a 5-seater instead of the 7-seater I'd rented. So I said, no, I don't want that, I want the 7-seater or a refund. But they didn't seem keen to give me either, in all honesty. I'd booked this through Expedia as well, because I thought Expedia was quite trustworthy. And yeah, I got this really, really bad service. So then we're all stranded at the airport, it's raining really heavily, and, they've just arrived and we're not having a good time. So then we have to, after a lot of deliberation, get a taxi back to our house, which, as you can imagine, it's a bit like a minibus. It took 4 hours and it was hard in the pouring rain. Not to mention a little bit expensive. So yeah, it was just pretty annoying because rental companies not delivering on their promises, rental company being unhelpful. The taxi driver halfway through was like, hey, we're going through toll roads, so, you're paying those, right? When we'd agreed beforehand that we'd pay half and half. So yeah, it was a lot of stress yesterday, which is why yesterday's video was delayed. I did it in the morning, and then come the evening when I got back, way later than I thought I'd be here, it was delayed. Sorry about that. In any case, I do hope that you enjoyed yesterday's video if you saw it. But yeah, it was a pretty stressful day. Oh, and to add insult to injury, this morning when I woke up, I got an email from Expedia saying as a one-time thing, like as a courtesy, the company are willing to give you a refund even though you were a no-show, and it just made me so angry because they're the ones who didn't show up. Not to mention the fact that another car rental company guy was like, yeah, I can give you a car. He quoted me like nearly $2,000 for 2 weeks, which is, it's mad. I can't afford that. So I said to him, I can't afford that. I paid like way less. And he's like, oh, it's probably they probably have the car or are planning to rent it to someone else. But because you paid so little, they don't want to rent it to you anymore. And that's why they just didn't show up. And I was thinking, geez, that's really out of order. So yeah, they're going to get a whole load of 1-star reviews on Google and other review sites. And yeah, I'm going to have to send Expedia a really fat, angry email saying that this service is terrible. So that's just more stress adding to other stuff. But yeah, it's the holidays now. I'm assuming most people are going to be getting time off work soon. So I hope that you all have a very happy holiday. Remember, there should be regular uploads from here on out. So yeah, stick around, stay tuned, and I'll see you all in the next one.